Okay, hello everyone. While people are still joining from the waiting room, I'll just give a quick introduction and welcome to the Phase Network webinar series. This is the Population Health Agent-Based Simulation Network funded by UK Prevention Research Partnership. Corinna, can you see my screen? Okay, is it shared appropriately?
Yeah, I can.
Thank you. So the idea for the Phase Network is it's trying to create and cultivate connections between a range of different communities. There's an agent-based modeling community that traditionally hasn't done a lot of work in health. There's the public health research and also the public health policy and practitioner community. So what the aim for the Phase Network is to allow people to interact and find out how ABMs can be used in their population health work. So as part of beginning to build that network, can I ask everyone on the call to introduce yourself in the chat so you can follow this format of hi, I am, my main interests are, and also to say why you're attending the Phase webinars. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Mark McCann, based at the Social and Public Health Sciences Unit. I'm a researcher, so most of my research is around mental health, substance use, and I have a particular interest in social network analysis and broader systems science and systems thinking methods. And I'm really interested to find out what the people on the call what they want to do as part of the Phase network and how they want to get involved with Phase. In addition, during the webinar, please use the Q&A for any questions, and then at the end there'll be some time we'll review those questions. This is part of a series, so these are the dates for the next webinars. We'll have Jen Badham talking about a formalized what-if approach, how ABMs can be used for formalizing a what-if approach to policy decision-making. Then Rick Colasanti will be talking about how we go about using ABMs in a public health context. In addition, we've also got an early career researcher seminar on the 26th with 3 early career researchers talking about the ABMs that they've built and they're working on a range of public health topics you can see there. So I'd highly recommend all of the additional events after this webinar. And finally, I pointed towards the website phasenetwork.org. We have a self-learner curriculum. So this is a set of resources for 3 audiences: people who know nothing about agent-based modeling, but would like to know more; people who know quite a bit about ABMs, but not about the specifics of applying them to public health; and also those who know a lot about public health, may not be involved, might not have a role in doing modeling themselves, but want to find out how models and working with modelers could be useful for their public health work. So you can also sign up to be a member of the Phase network. So if you go to the website, you can get in touch with us if you want to find a collaborator or ask us a question, and we also keep in touch with regular information. Okay, so just to clarify, this session is being recorded, so please bear that in mind if you want to ask any questions. I'm really pleased to welcome Corinna Elsenbroich, who's going to talk about ABMs and complexity. So Corinna was a co-investigator in CCAN, Centre for Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. And I was going to say recently, but it's probably a while ago now to say she joined us as a reader in computational modelling here at the University of Glasgow. So Corinna is particularly interested in methodology, how combinations of methods can be applied to understand complex phenomena, but also the philosophical underpinnings of how we are trying to understand a complex world. And we've had some great discussions and project plans, particularly around youth mental health, and I'm really looking forward to hear what she'll tell us about during this webinar. So Corinna, about 40-45 minutes, and then time for questions at the end. So over to you.
Okay, there was a question about a transcript. I don't know whether that has been turned on. That would be
I'll enable the transcript now.
if we could put that on. Okay, so can you all see my screen? Is that all good?
Yep.
I hope so.
Transcriptions
Fantastic.
are on.
So very happy to be here and do this webinar for for phase. This is a bit of a sort of introductory webinar on agent-based modeling and complex systems. Yeah, so I'm going to go through different aspects of this title: agent-based modeling and complex systems. I'm going to start off with modeling, because I think it's really important to understand what the models are and what the simulation models are. So let's start off with some definitions. A model is a representation of relevant features and relationships of some target system. So if we're thinking about models, we have to think about a target system, like the real world that we're trying to model. And then we have to make decisions about what are the relevant features and relationships that we think are important for us to model in order to fulfill, enhance our understanding of the target system, for example. And it's really important to keep in mind that a model is a representation of a target system and not the target system itself. So there is a famous painting by René Magritte, Ceci n'est pas une pipe. And the point is, this is not a pipe. This is a representation of a pipe. So keep this in mind. A model is a representation of a target system. So is this a representation? Is this a model of a horse? It shares some relevant features. It's the Le Corbusier lounger in pony skin. So it's made of pony skin. It has horse skin as a thing. It has 4 legs. You can sit on it. But is it a model of a horse? I'd say no. Ceci n'est pas une représentation d'un cheval. Okay? This isn't a representation of a horse, even though it shares some features with a horse. It's not intended as a representation of a horse, and thus it's not a model of a horse. On the other hand, this, that shares no physicality whatsoever with horses, is a computational representation of a horse shape. It picks out the relevant features for a representation of a horse, not just any old features, not the skin kind of thing. It picks out the relevant features that we need to represent a horse. And that's why this is a model, whereas this is not a model of a horse. Now, agent-based models are models, but they are a specific kind of models. They are simulation models. And simulations are models. They are, again, representations of a target system. But simulation models are dynamic models. And what they do is they represent a process by another process, a process in the target system by a process in the simulation model. Okay, again, the same representation relationship, but now not about something static, but about something dynamic. So is this a simulation of a horse? It moves, it's dynamic. You can, pictures flicker by. Is this a simulation of a horse? Not unless we want to represent the process of skinning a horse, because here we're seeing the outer layer of a horse, then the muscular layer of the horse, the skeletal layer of the horse, and then the inner organs. But this is not a process. It's showing us different aspects of a horse, but it's not a simulation. This is just the joining together of 4 models of a horse, of 4 representations, the skin representation, skeletal, etc. On the other hand, this is a simulation of the horse's gait. These 2 computational models are simulating the process of how a horse moves. Okay, so first bit done for the talk, modeling. A model is a representation of a target system, the relevant features of the target system. And a simulation model is the representation of a process within the target system by another process in your simulation model. Now, the second bit of the title is for complex systems. The second bit that I want to look at is for complex systems, so modeling for complex systems. Complexity is a great word. Loads of people are now using it. Everything's a bit complex, blah, blah. There was a sort of a really nice history of complexity research, in particular sort of computational complexity research that agent-based modeling has its starting point in, from the Santa Fe Institute. And this is this book by Waldrop Very, very nice, really nice read about complexity and the history of the Santa Fe Institute. And they have a starting point of modeling complexity by saying, look, we have to model the bits of complexity, the little bits that make up a complex system, and we can devise computational models through which we can understand complex dynamics developing. But what is complexity in the first place? So complexity is a bit more than things being complicated, to start with. Complexity, as a definition, is a property of a system or a system of systems resulting from the parts and the relationships between system parts. Complexity leads to the impossibility to partition the system, to analyze parts in isolation. So now there are two bits that I want to point to in this definition. And the first one is that this sort of a property of a system or system of systems resulting from the parts and the relationships between the parts. If you're thinking back of how we defined a model, a representation of relevant features and relationships of those features, okay? You can already see where the model and the complex system align. It's looking at the bits, the parts, the features, and the relationships. And it is this focus on the relationships of the parts that is the starting point for why a complex system is a complex system and why you can't partition it, because the relationships between the parts are the important aspect that bring about systems behavior. Okay. As a small little example to make things, to explain the relationship between simple, complicated, and complex, this is a standard example used. A cake is a simple system. You are mashing together some ingredients, and you stick it in the oven and you get a cake out. I don't find baking that easy. I'm quite a good cook. I'm a terrible baker, so for me, cakes probably move a bit into the more complicated part, but let's leave it as an example for simplicity. Cakes are simple. Rockets, on the other hand, are really quite complicated. Rockets have lots of subsystems. There's a fuel system, and there if you have a rocket where there's a human in there, there needs to be air support, oxygen support, and whatever in there. And it needs a lot of technical skill and technical knowledge to build a rocket. Okay. However, once you have built the complicated system of a rocket, that's it. Then your rocket is done and you can launch it off. It can break afterwards or something like that. But the rocket as such is done. It's a very complicated system, but once it's built, the rocket is a rocket. And that's a very different proposition from having a child. And that's the last bit of the simple, complicated, complex example. Having a child is not something you build like a rocket. Having a child is, you have a child, and initially you think, oh, I can keep my child completely controlled by just keeping it on my leg, attached to my leg, attached to my arm. But then you realize your child is interacting with loads of other aspects of the world, with loads of other people and institutions like schools or nurseries, and it goes on and on and on. And your child is developing within the environment, within the relationships that it's establishing throughout his lifetime, and it's adapting and it's developing continuously. It's never finished. It's never the finished rocket, which you then can just launch off. And that is what is meant, this is just to give you an idea of why it's important to think about complexity as something that goes above something being complicated, a complicated system, like a rocket, which can still be finished. To look at another definition of complexity, and this is this is going more into the social sciences. This is from the Non-Equilibrium Social Science book by Johnson et al. And here we have that complex systems are systems that comprise many interacting parts with the ability to generate a new quality of macroscopic collective behavior, the manifestations of which are the spontaneous formation of distinctive temporal, spatial, and functional structures. And the reason I'm giving you this definition as well is because it has three aspects of complexity that are really important for agent-based modeling, which we get to afterwards. So we have heterogeneity. We have lots of different interacting parts, which can be substantially different from each other. Okay, they can be people and institutions and artifacts and nature, and you have already 4 completely different types of parts interacting with each other. Then complex systems are dynamic, they're evolving over time. There is something happening across time and maybe across space. And the third thing that this definition relies on is emergence, the spontaneous formation of distinctive temporal, spatial, and functional patterns or structures. Okay, keep these 3 words in mind: dynamics, heterogeneity, and emergence. Now, as I say, this definition moves already into the sort of more social science, the ideas of complexity. And the important thing here is that when we're trying to understand society or the social, we have to understand a lot of different aspects of people, of people's behaviors, of people's motivations. And we also have to start measuring the sort of more aggregate aspects like patterns, structural patterns that we can find. But a crux for understanding societies is that we have to understand change over time. We have to understand interactions between individuals, and we have to understand relationships. And now I show you a tiny, tiny little film that gives you an idea of how tricky things become, even with the tiniest relationship. Okay, so here we have the film of the double pendulum, and you can see 2 dots that are moving through space, and the green dot is very well behaved, whereas the brown dot is very erratic. Okay, so the green dot is just very simply hooked up and is moving along its axis. The brown dot is a double pendulum with 2 arms, and just by adding this one link to the behavior, to the movement of the brown dot, you're getting entirely erratic behavior. So any additional complexity can give you something that explodes quite quickly once you're looking at interactions, relationships, and dynamics. So we've done modeling, we've done complex systems, and now we're getting into the agent-based modeling part. Why do we want to use agent-based modeling to model complex systems? So what's an agent-based model? An agent-based model is agent-based modeling is a computational method that enables a researcher to create, analyze, and experiment with models composed of agents that interact within an environment. That is sort of a standard definition coming from Gilbert, 2008. I think it's just called agent-based modeling. It's a little sage book. It's very good. So it's a computational model that models agents that are interacting with each other and within an environment. So there is a dynamic, they're interacting over time. So it's a simulation model, which means already we have to represent a process in the real world by a process in the model. Agent-based models, or the ingredients of agent-based models, are an environment. Okay, we had this definition that there are agents that are interacting within an environment. Then we have agents, otherwise there wouldn't be agent-based models. So we have agents in an environment. Then we have some interactions. Here we have these little links that you can see, the little lines between agents could be, for example, friendship links. Then we have autonomy. That means every agent makes an autonomous decision or has an autonomous behavior step by step by step. Here, for example, the autonomy would be for each agent is moving one step in a random direction at every time it's his turn in a simulation model. So that's a sort of random movement type behavior that the agents would have. Or they might have behaviors that are more complex, like a follow my friend behavior, which you can see here. That just means every agent follows an agent that they're linked to with an initial network link that we started off with as the interaction link. And here you can see already a pattern emerging from the initial conditions that we had in this very simple model, where you have one big friendship group here and a very small friendship group there, which just means that these three were just not connected to anyone initially in the network, okay? Which you couldn't have seen at this stage where we just put the network links in, for example. So these are the basic ingredients of an agent-based model. An environment, agents that have autonomy, and some behaviors in how they're interacting. Okay, now I'm going to walk you through my favorite agent-based model, and I hope it becomes your favorite agent-based model as well. No, I think it's a really nice model to make a lot of points along the way for this model, because it's complicated enough to be relevant and it's simple enough to still be understandable. So a model, in particular an agent-based model, starts with wonder. It starts with a question. It starts with a problem where you're saying, why? Why is this so? So let's have a look at the model of the English housing market. Probably should be the English and Welsh housing market, but probably not that much further, and I get to that in a moment. So this is a model that was put together by Nigel Gilbert and PricewaterhouseCoopers over 2007. It was published in 2008. So let's go back to a model starting with wonder and think, we're wondering about the housing market, the English housing market. We can start off with ask some general questions. We might want to understand why there are housing bubbles, for example, or why there are some areas that are more expensive than other areas. Or we can start thinking about some general questions about something specific to do with the housing market. So something like the influence of macroeconomic factors on the housing market, like inflation. What happens if inflation rises massively? Or what happens if interest rates rise massively? Funnily enough, I've used this model for teaching over a long time, and all these things seemed completely irrelevant. All of a sudden, they're very relevant to all our lives, which is interesting how the world changes. Or you can start having very specific questions about something very specific to do with the housing market. So, looking at a particular government policy like a stamp duty holiday or a first-time buyer scheme or 100% mortgage rates, okay? But you're starting out with a question or with a set of questions that you're trying to answer, and that's the starting point for your model. The next step, once you have decided that the kinds of questions or the questions that you want to answer, the kinds of questions that you want to answer. So if they're all policy questions, you might need something that is, you need to put in certain things about policy. If they're all macroeconomic questions about the housing market, you might have to be more detailed about your macroeconomic variables. But what you're doing at the point, you have your question, you have your research question, then you go out into the world and you find out as much as you can about this target system. Because remember, a model is a representation of relevant features and relationships of a target system. So you need to go out and find out what the relevant features are and what they consist of in order to build a good model. So for the housing system, at one layer, you have to ask yourself, okay, I want to build an agent-based model. So who are the agents that are relevant within the housing market? And there are buyers and sellers, of course, maybe renters, not in this model, but they could be. In this model, there are buyers, sellers, and realtors, which is the American term for estate agents, which the authors use in the documentation for this model, because having estate agents in agent-based model and talking about agents and estate agents is too confusing. So they're called realtors. And realtors, so these are the agents that you have. And then you have to figure out what they do. And they have behaviors. So buyers want to buy houses and sellers want to sell houses. But sellers want to sell houses to the maximum possible price that they can get on the market. Okay, so that's written into their behavior, that they want to maximize the house that they're getting. And buyers want to buy the maximum house that they can afford given their income and their savings, for example. And from these few behaviors, from these two actors or two different agents, you already know some things that you have to find out. What kinds of savings do people have? What kinds of incomes do people have? How much mortgage can people take out, etc. So that you get to this idea where a buyer can buy something to the maximum that they can afford. Yeah. And then you have the estate agents or realtors, and they are the middlemen of the housing market, which sort of suggest house prices to sellers and negotiate with buyers and sellers in order to make a sale happen. So these are the three kinds of agents that we have in this housing market model. And then, of course, we need some houses. Okay, so at the bottom, the environment needs some houses that can be sold and bought. And as I said, for example, for the buyer, where you have an idea that they want to spend the maximum they can afford on a house, what we need then are some background macroeconomic aspects of a housing market, right? So we need to know something about mortgage rates. We need to know something about loan to value ratios, maybe. We need to know something about employment and incomes and savings and how they're distributed. We might want to know something about migration into the housing market and out of the housing market. We might want to know something about the rate of construction of houses, because all of these things will have an influence on housing market transactions. So it's really important to think about this step where you're finding out a lot of empirical stuff about the target system you're trying to represent in a model. Yeah, I get to that a bit later. So you're finding out things about the agents that you want to model, as well as sort of background features of a system, like the macroeconomic features. And once you have found out loads of empirical stuff about the system you're trying to model in order to answer some specific questions, or some questions that you have about the system, about the target system, then in order to model them in an agent-based model, you have to sort of start operationalizing them and trying to figure out what the interactions are between your agents. So you have to figure out, what do estate agents do with buyers and with sellers, for example. And I think this is something why I like this model so much, because it has these three different agents that are interacting with each other: the buyers, the sellers, and the realtors. And one of the really fabulous things about this model is that Nigel Gilbert essentially just went into a few estate agent offices and said, so how do you do this with valuing houses? And they said, oh, we just look at what we sold in the near vicinity, which is slightly similar, and we're putting a 10% markup on the house price, and then we say to the buyer, oh, let's put it on the market for that. Okay. And then they also told him a second thing that they do, which is if the house is staying on the market for too long, we incrementally start dropping the price until we find a buyer. Okay, so we have two behavioral dynamics that are happening. One is a 10% markup on houses that go on the market, and the other one is a reduction of house price over time if the house is on the market for too long. Then, in order to put all these behaviors that you found in the real world into an agent-based model, you have to start operationalizing them and abstracting from them. So, for example, here you can see the little yellow dots with the circles around them. For an agent-based model, you might have found out that realtors work in a particular area. They have a particular area in which they work in, and you operationalize it as, okay, they have a circle around their office in which they work. And then you are starting to have a nice little model from the knowledge and information that you gathered about your target system. You put it all together and you start having a model of a housing market. So here at the bottom is the link to where you can find the model. Here you can see the model of the English housing market implemented in NetLogo. And what you can see is this sort of macroeconomic variables that are important. There are some buyer variables that are important. There are some estate agent or realtor variables that are important for the housing market. There are some bits about houses and house construction rates, etc. And here on the right-hand side, you have stuff that is measured, outcome measures of your model. So for example, the overall population, house price distributions, the median house price, some macroeconomic things about incomes and Gini indexes and indices, I guess, mortgage repayment and income ratios, number of transactions, and how long a house is on the market. Now, this bit here in the middle where you can see the yellow dots and circles is the initialization of a housing market, of the housing market model. All the green bits are green space. They're just, they're just bits where there are no houses. And the different colors here mean that I think the darker the shade of the red, the more expensive the house is. So to start with, we have a random distribution of expensive and cheap houses across this interface, across the grid. And the first thing we can do is we initialize this housing market model with a set of parameters and we just run it. And after a while, what we find is that we're getting, so these are the estate agents, these are the realtors, the yellow dots. We're starting to get patterns of more expensive areas. These have moved away from blue, away from red into blue, so they're like really expensive by now. And much cheaper areas, which are yellow. So we get this emergence of more expensive and cheaper areas just by having the underlying interactions of buyers, sellers, and realtors, okay, that are doing this 10% markup and people are buying and selling. Now, what are other important bits? We get the emergence of more expensive and cheaper house areas. We get measurements about, this is quite a stable housing market here. We have a relatively even time on the market for houses. We have a fairly constant number of transactions. And house prices are also really quite stable. Not much is happening in the environment that was initialized as it was here on the input variables, which are green. Now you can do other stuff with agent-based models, right? So here we have a replication of the housing market, which shows us over time the emergence of differences in house prices by areas. Okay, that's already a finding. But you can also start experimenting with agent-based models. And as I said, this was published in 2008, and this came just after the credit crunch, essentially, which had a huge impact on the housing market, right? And if you are starting to experiment with this housing market model about the stuff that happened in the real world during the credit crunch, one of the things that banks were no longer allowed to do, we go back here, we had a loan-to-value ratio of 80% here. At the time of the credit crunch, the loan-to-value ratio was actually by 100%, sometimes 120%. You could, the banks said, the prices are going up, I can give you 120% mortgages on your property. But the credit crunch meant that they were no longer able to give you these really high loan-to-value ratios, but loan-to-value ratios dropped to 60, 70%, something like that. So you can start experimenting with your model and say, ooh, what happens in a housing market that I have replicated with the relevant behaviors if I drop the loan-to-value ratio? And what happens here is, we drop the loan-to-value ratio mid-simulation, not from the start, but we let the housing market run and we get, this nice sort of house prices are going through the roof as it was at the time. And then we get a a massive change to the loan to value ratio, and we see a massive drop in house prices. Sorry, I didn't want to show you that yet. Go back. Okay, we get a massive drop in house prices, and we can, this is interesting. This is an interesting phenomenon. What is even more interesting is that that is pretty much exactly what happened to the housing market in the UK at the point where the change to the loan to value ratio came in. Now, that might be a fluke of luck. Just pattern replication is never enough to actually say we got it right. However, what this model allows us to do, I mean, first of all, this is quite a surprising event, right? That just dropping the loan to value ratio to 60% brings about a housing price crash. I don't know how many of you can just predict it from thin air, or know the mechanism that lies behind it. But what is interesting with this model is that you can look at why this happens. And the reason why this happens, this crash in median house prices, is, if you look here, the median time on the market for the properties shoots up. Okay, and we had this rule from the realtors that if a house is on the market for too long, we incrementally start dropping the price. So here we have the explanation of why the housing prices drop, because they are on the market for too long. So that's the first explanation. House prices drop because they're on the market for too long, and there's a mechanism when they drop the prices. But why are they on the market for so long? And that's again something where you can look in the model dynamics to find an answer. And the reason is that first-time buyers have the biggest problem financing this loan to value ratio gap, the deposit for their first property. And if they can only get a 60% mortgage, they have to make up the 40% that are left with their savings. But first-time buyers have a real problem bringing up these high amounts of savings. So it's the first-time buyers not being there that shift the time up. But why is that? And this is why it's really about the English housing market, or the English and Welsh housing market, because, I mean, this would not be the same in the German market, because we have a very different kind of house buying behavior. But in the English housing market, you have this thing where, you buy your first flat, and after a few years, you have a bit more income, and you have made some repayments on your flat, and you have a bigger deposit, and then you buy your first terraced house, and then you're buying your first semi-detached house, and hopefully you're then buying your first detached house. So you're moving up a housing ladder. And this concept of a housing ladder is what brings about the credit crunch, or the change, the extreme change in house prices here, through a change in loan to value ratio. Because when the first-time buyers cannot buy the flat, the person in the flat cannot buy the terrace, that one cannot buy the semi-detached house, and so on. So you get this chain reaction. And that is the reason why all of a sudden loads of properties are too long on the market and the prices are dropping. So the model helped us to understand not just that there is a price crash on the change of loan to value ratio, but also why, because they're on the market for too long. And it helped us understand why they're on the market for too long, because the first-time buyers can no longer get on the first step of the housing ladder. So why is AVM good for modeling complexity? Well, I hope you got a gist from the housing model why that is. We're modeling, remember back, complex systems are systems of systems with interacting parts, where these interactions bring about new temporal spatial patterns, emergent patterns. Now, with the housing market model, we can see how the interaction of buyers, sellers, realtors, the sort of housing market, the housing ladder chain brings about macroscopic behaviors of market crashes, depending on some economic variables. So we're getting these interactions of heterogeneous agents. We get the emergence of more expensive and less expensive areas. So a spatial pattern is emerging. And we can explore these nonlinear relationships of the loan to value ratio, for example. Now, remember back, I said a model starts with wonder. An agent-based model in particular starts with wonder. It does not start with a data set or even two data sets. An agent-based model is not something that is just a description of what happens between two data sets. You might have, you might know that the median house price in the 1990s was £57,000 and that the median house prices in the 2020s is 250,000, and you want to explain this phenomenon, yeah? But an agent-based model is not the dynamics of incrementally rising house prices, which is essentially what happened, right? Between the 1990s data set and between the 2020 data set, you just have an incremental rise, maybe until 2008, where there's a little dip, and then you have a rise again. But that is not the dynamic that you are replicating within an agent-based model. What you're doing in an agent-based model is you're actually trying to replicate the process of people buying and selling and realtors marking up house prices. And it's that process you're trying to replicate in order to explain why you have the phenomenon of extreme rise in house prices. So an agent-based model does not start with a data set or two, and is not a model that just explains how you get from one data set to another one. That's a statistical model, or maybe a micro simulation where you say, that's the rate of change I can read off two data sets. An agent-based model starts off with a phenomenon, like here, house price inequality or house price differentials across a country. And it says, how can we explain these extreme differences in house prices across different areas? And then it starts looking at how could we get there? What is happening? So what are the activities that have to do with house prices? Well, there are activities of buying and selling and maybe house building and maybe migration, all the things we went to in the beginning when I said gather as much information about the target system as you can find. And with an agent-based model, you will never find a nice sort of linear thing like these arrows, like the arrows in a row, the ducks in a row. You will find loads of different processes that might go together. So you have the realtor process of marking up houses. You might have a macroeconomic process of rising inflation. And these processes coming together bring about a certain phenomenon. So you're starting off with the phenomenon that you want to explain. You're figuring out what are the steps that might explain this. So what are the processes in the real world? And I can't focus on that enough. You have to understand the processes underlying the phenomenon, okay? And then, only then do you look at data to actually calibrate and validate your model, to look whether you have the right kinds of pattern, for example, yeah? So I think it's really important to think about agent-based models not as these things that explain two data sets or best fit two data sets, but they function on another level of saying, okay, the pattern that I'm interested in is the result of a complex system of interacting agents, interacting institutions, etc. And what is it about this? What is the process of interactions that is resulting in the phenomenon that I'm interested in? So ABM are good at certain things, really good at certain things, understanding heterogeneity and consequences of heterogeneity. By heterogeneity, I mean, for example, the three kinds of agents, sellers, buyers, and realtors, as well as in the housing market model, you can see what happens to people on very low incomes and who can never move any step further on the housing ladder, for example. So that's also a level of heterogeneity, the level of wealth and income that you have. They're very good at understanding emergence as a result of interactions at of the heterogeneous agents that you're modeling. And they're really good at showing these sort of chain reactions, like the housing ladder, you know, that the detached house could not be sold because the semi-detached could not be sold, because the terrace could not be sold, because the flat could not be sold. What you need for an ABM in order to buy one is a question, a phenomenon in the world, a pattern in the world that you're trying to explain. And then you have to have a lot of good empirical knowledge about the system that's underlying that pattern you're trying to explain. So house prices, the housing market, maybe income inequalities, the labor market, maybe education inequalities, the school system. Okay, but it's under, you know, the phenomenon is one thing, the system of which it is a feature, that is what you're trying to model in an agent-based model. So you have to know what your agents do, how they interact, what are the transactions that are relevant for the model that you're building. And then you need data to parameterize. You have to have, you know, the macroeconomic data in the housing model needed to be quite close to reality, for example. And the most important bit is ABM do not replace empirical research. You need to still do all the empirical, you need to get the empirical information from the target system, from the real world in order to build ABM. ABM are there to extrapolate your knowledge, to understand the dynamics that are unfolding from the empirical knowledge that you have found about, because our brains are not quite big enough to, you know, go through all the transactions at the scale of a society of 10,000 agents interacting or something like that. But they do not, they extrapolate and summarize and bring together different aspects of the real world that you know about, of the target system, but they do not replace empirical research. So to sum up, complexity brings challenges for the social sciences because it's really difficult to isolate parts of the system. So you can't, you know, proper experimental designs are really difficult to do, etc. And agent-based modeling is a method that can deal with some of these challenges that complexity brings, because it tries to replicate the complexity of the social world by saying, oh, the complexity of the social world comes about because it's people interacting with each other in a dynamic way over time. And an agent-based model is saying, okay, let's replicate the processes that are underlying these interactions, or that make up these interactions, and see what is happening in a model. Okay. And they're very good at, once you understand the processes and once you start modeling the processes, to give you ideas of nonlinear and emergent phenomena and how, you know, consequences of certain interventions into this complex system, like a change to loan to value ratio. What they do not do, and I think this is equally important to what they do, ABM do not describe data sets. Okay, they use data in order to inform the model parameterization. They might use data to identify patterns that you want to model, but they're not this thing that sits between two data sets as estimates of how you get from one to the other. Agent-based models do not give you the mechanism how you get from time step 1 to time step 2, or from data set 1 to data set 2. Agent-based models need you to put in the mechanism. So a mechanism of the housing market was that that realtors are putting a 10% markup, and another mechanism of the housing market crash was that the house prices get reduced incrementally as houses are too long on the market. ABM do not, I can't say this often enough, they do not replace empirical research. Okay, that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Corinna. Yeah, fantastic and very insightful talk. Really enjoyed that. Can I open it up to see, does anyone have any questions? You can use the Q&A, or if you raise your hand, I can see if you can ask a question verbally. while people are having to think and working on the Q&A, I might just begin. And can I ask you, from the perspective of a psychologist by background, and we tend to focus on the data sets and how, there's average trends for an individual. The kind of data on how people interact or where people sit in a ladder of behaviors related to health isn't sort of the data that we collect or the way we'd think through the mechanisms. And equally, maybe local public health policies or community organizations that implement an initiative, they may not have in mind any particular set of interactions of heterogeneous agents to inform why they implement that intervention. How would someone coming from a psychological data set point of view, or a community program setting that up, where would they start to think through where an ABM could come in useful?
You have to talk to your local ABM person and tell them. I mean, it is really. I think that is really I think that's a big crux point, and it's in particular possibly a big crux point between the public health and the ABM community. There might even be a very different definition of mechanism, but I haven't quite come to the point where I can put my finger on the exact differences here. But I mean, I described my pet agent-based model because it is so complex in one way. So it describes a really complex system of a housing market and can replicate real-world patterns, but it relies on such simple behaviors of buying and selling and these two realtor behaviors. For other agent-based models, usually the agent-based modeler is sitting there going, I have no idea about the decision-making. I have no idea what the actual decisions are, why somebody goes out and goes cycling okay, you can model it, on a nice day, they're likely to cycle. On a rainy day, they're less likely, but then you have no idea why they always go cycling on a Friday, but never on a Thursday, or stuff like that. And you will have to, really collaborate closely to try and figure out qualitatively sometimes, what are reasons for people to make certain decisions. And there's a lot of work in agent-based modeling where it's really about trying to figure out from qualitative data how we can transport these sort of qualitative rules into agent rules, and how we can still make sense of the heterogeneity of agents and how they make decisions and truthfully represent that. But it's a huge problem for modeling that quite often we just don't know.
Thank you. Again, that really reinforces the role of the phase network in trying to bring together that kind of communication by the modeling side of things and the various sources of academic expertise and knowledge of the practices on the ground. Could you say a little bit more about how you validate an agent-based model? As in, how do you know it's right enough? It's telling you.
There are loads of questions about validating ABM, and just before I started, I took the slide on verification and validation out because I thought it was too much on the teaching side of how to build ABM. That entirely depends on what your ABM is and what you're trying to model in your ABM. So there are very abstract ABMs that are looking at really just very abstract dynamics of opinion influences between people. Well, there's the validation of those models is, do you get some radicalization? Can you get to a consensus? And do you get a split society under certain conditions? And if you can get all three, then that's a good model in a way, because that's how opinion dynamics can function. So that's very abstract. In general, validation is a debate within ABM, and that is also because there are so many different kinds of ABM. So the more empirically grounded an ABM, the more important it is to have good data for validation, but the more difficult it is as well. And for me personally, I would always go down the route of sort of pattern-oriented modeling for agent-based modeling. You don't have to get the exact numbers, but if you get the right kinds of patterns at the right kind of level that your model functions, then your model has a good level of validation. That might be a bit of a cop-out. As I say, it's an ongoing discussion within ABM, which I'm not going to solve here, but this is my view on validation in agent modeling.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? I'd also like to say thank you for everyone who's been updating their interests and in the chat. There's certainly a wide range of expertise and areas that are of interest.
Sorry, I was just reading the last entry to the chat, thinking that it might have been a question, but it isn't.
Can I also ask you about, so again, this sort of relates to validation. I'm thinking in particular in relation to health inequalities. So the extent to which there's a patterning and a sustained patterning for certain health risks to occur in certain subsections of the population, either geographically or socially, and how can features like that be explored in an ABM? Like, I'm wondering, you mentioned there about the difference in house price between, and you can see on a map of England and Wales, there is kind of a sustained pattern for some areas to be of higher value than others. How can an agent-based modeling approach start to look at dynamics of, are some things fixed and not as easily, or without certain types of intervention going to change?
I think, I mean, one of the problems is, and that's one of the problems for within modeling these health inequalities, which is actually kind of funny, is that you need to have agent behaviors, but of course you don't want to put into your model that, you know, all the people that are going to be unhealthy are smoking and drinking, and that's why they're really unhealthy. So, you know, in the sense of building in the behaviors that lead to. So you have to think about what are the processes that you think lead to the health inequalities. And for example, if you are more on the sort of materialist side, you would say, well, there are labor market exclusion processes. So let's start thinking about modeling a labor market system and access to labor market and maybe an education system and the interaction between the two, and see whether we can get from the behaviors within the labor market, we can get to the inequalities that lead to the health inequalities. Okay, so you're not building in the behaviors that directly lead to the health inequalities, but you're looking at one step removed, what are important access points, for example, where you say, wage differentials will lead to different decision making in terms of nutrition, access to health and leisure, etc., etc. And then you're saying, I think it's the labor market we have to look at, and labor market access and labor market transactions, rather than the direct health behaviors. But you have to be very clear about what you think are the processes in the real world and the actions of actors that lead to the health inequalities that you are trying to explain.
Again, that brings us back to the importance of the discussions between the different perspectives, yeah, what the mechanisms would be.
Yeah.
It's just at 2 o'clock, so I want to try and keep the time. If there's one or two further questions, do you have time to stay on, Corinna, just to answer?
I can very quickly go, at least the first one is, how do you incorporate qualitative data into the ABM process? I mean, that's a really huge area of research. Actually, there's a lot of research on that. You literally you can start doing interviews and ask people, how do you make decisions? How do you make decisions about budgeting under constraints? And then you can initialize your agents by saying, you know, I found people telling me that if I have limited money, then at the beginning of the month I spend a lot, and towards the end of the month I spend very little. and you can implement this directly into agent behaviors if that's what you're interested in. You know, for example, at the beginning of the month, they eat some nice food, and at the end of the month, they only eat beans on toast. Okay, nothing against beans on toast, but is an example. So there's a lot of, you know, the qualitative data is actually the more important for initializing and conceptualizing an ABM. And then the last question is, have I understood correctly, an ABM approach can help to explore, identify mechanisms that you are not aware of occurring within the system. For example, you showed some of the outcome measures in the housing ABM as an explanation for the drop in the house prices. Let's put it that way. You put the mechanisms in, but the ABM will show you follow-on chains of events, causal chains that are results of the mechanisms in some ways. So the mechanisms that go into the agent-based model is the reduction of prices of when they're too long, when the houses are too long on the market, etc. The causal chain I tried to show you was the drop in house prices, and then to look, why do the house prices drop? And that is because the houses are on the market for too long. And that relationship comes from the mechanism of dropping the price that came from the estate agent. And why they are on the market for too long came from first-time buyers not being able to enter the housing ladder. Okay, so these were the mechanisms we put in. These are consequences of the mechanisms that we can then find out as hanging together within the simulation model. So the ABM is not a method to find out mechanisms. It's only a method to test mechanisms. If by mechanisms we mean these interactions. So hopefully that is more clear now.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks very much again, Corinna. It was a brilliant talk. The recording will be available afterwards. Also, please sign up to the Phase Network. You can get in touch at phasenetwork.org, and hope to see you at the next webinar.